Tonight on Primetime Politics, looking for guarantees.
Surely the government would have negotiated a jobs guarantee for every single Canadian Stellantis employee.
Conservatives push the Carney government on deals signed by the Trudeau Liberals, looking to see if Ottawa has any legal way of keeping assembly jobs in Brampton, Ontario. Coming up, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Industry on why that disclosure is important. Also, Brampton's Mayor Patrick Brown will ask what he wants Ottawa to do. And how much wiggle room does the government have with the upcoming federal budget? Former Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page will join the program. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The president of Stellantis Canada was summoned to Ottawa today, called to meet with the industry minister, Melanie Joly. Now, Joly is threatening to sue the automaker for moving jobs out of Brampton, Ontario, which the government says goes against commitments made by Stellantis when they signed agreements with Ottawa in recent years. That has opposition Conservatives asking what kind of guarantees does the government actually have?
So simple yes or no question. Is there an ironclad guarantee of every single worker's job here in Canada in exchange for that $15 billion handout?
An hour ago, I met here in Ottawa with the head of Canadian Stellantis, with the head of Unifor, and also with the Minister of Economic Development of Ontario. We're one strong team, Canada, and we will make sure that these jobs stay in Brampton.
Now, in a moment, we'll get some reaction to that exchange from Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown. But first, we are reaching out to Raquel Dancho, the Conservative Shadow Minister for Industry. She joins us in the foyer of the House of Commons. Ms. Dancho, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Listen, I think it's worthwhile to walk through your logic here, because what your caucus, your leader, what you're asking for are the contracts that the previous Liberal government signed with Stellantis. What are you trying to do here? Understand the terms of that contract, understand the government's ability to actually sue the company? What exactly are you looking for?
Well, just a point of clarification, the minister responsible for these contracts is now the Finance Minister of Canada. And what we're trying to understand is the Liberal government made one of the largest corporate subsidies in Canadian history, $15 billion to Stellantis, which is one of the largest employers in our auto sector, $15 billion to produce electric vehicle batteries. And now just last week we learned the shocking and disappointing news that production at the Stellantis Brampton facility is now moving down to the United States, putting 3,000 Canadian jobs at risk. So what we're asking for is, surely with that $15 billion historic subsidy provided to Stellantis, were there no job guarantees for Canada, for the Canadian-wide job footprint from Stellantis? It would appear not. And so now we have 3,000 families that may not be able to pay their bills, for their mortgage, and ensure their kids have foods in their bellies. Like, this is a very shocking development out of a company that the Canadian taxpayer has provided $15 billion for this electric vehicle battery plant. So it's very disappointing.
Disappointing, but you still have not received the contracts. We know the industry minister says that the documents will be released over to the industry committee, of which you sit on as vice chair. But what if there is no clear guarantee? Is there no more obligation for Stellantis to actually protect these 3,000 jobs in Brampton?
Well, first of all, the contracts will be going to the Government Operations Committee, and they'll be provided in camera, so they won't be publicly available, at least not right away. And Conservatives have been calling for these contracts to be made public for over 2 years now for this very issue. We want to know what was promised or what was not promised to the Canadian taxpayer. Again, $15 billion is not chump change. This is a significant investment. In fact, it works out to $1,000 of federal taxes that each family in Canada, or each household in Canada would pay. So $1,000 for each Canadian household is invested in this $15 billion deal. And it would appear that no job guarantees were required for that $15 billion for Canada-wide Stellantis for their footprint. And we're a bit incredulous about it, because that's quite shocking. That is a huge number of taxpayer dollars, and yet no job guarantees. That is a bad deal from the Liberals.
Okay, but again, the documents still have to be reviewed to actually come to that conclusion. But what are you trying to do? Expose the government for what? Having a paper tiger threat? I'm still trying to understand your logic here, because I understand the conclusion you're jumping to, but that's before seeing the documents. What argument are you trying to make by actually getting these documents released?
Ultimately, a $15 billion deal should have guaranteed the Stellantis jobs in Canada. They employ thousands of Canadian auto sector workers. Now we're seeing 3,000 of those jobs at risk. In fact, a significant area of their production in Brampton is going down to Illinois in the United States, alongside a $13 billion commitment from Stellantis into the U.S., not into Canada. $13 billion to enrich thousands of American jobs. Why is it that Canadians are paying the price to subsidize American workers? It shouldn't be the case. So we want to see the contracts to see what kind of deal did the Liberals make for $15 billion. I think taxpayers expect quite a high bar of transparency and deliverables in that deal, and it would appear, based on the production moving to the U.S., based on 3,000 jobs being at risk, that they did not in fact guarantee a Canada-wide job footprint from Stellantis with $15 billion. I find that quite shocking.
Okay, and again, we'll have to see what the documents actually reveal. But how should Ottawa respond to that? At this point, you're waiting for a review of these documents, but we are already hearing from labor groups, from certainly even the Ontario PC government, saying that counter tariffs need to be applied here to send a signal to the U.S. that these trade policies are not acceptable. Does your party support the idea of counter tariffs in this moment in time?
Well, what we're seeing is manufacturing jobs, including in the auto sectors and others, bleeding to the United States at quite a rapid rate. In fact, over $50 billion of Canadian investment has outflowed to the U.S. since the Prime Minister has been in power over the last 7 months. That's a significant capital outflow, and that tells us that the Canadian business climate needs to be more competitive. So the Conservatives have put forward quite a comprehensive economic plan. We want to see Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, repealed. We want to see Bill C-48, the tanker ban, repealed. We want to see the emissions cap repealed. We want to see the industrial carbon
the auto
tax
industry,
repealed.
but vis-a-vis the because this is Stellantis, and the Brampton plant. What about the auto industry? I understand that the bills you're outlining has to do with the oil and gas industry, but what about the auto industry? Do you support a counter tariff?
Right, but the point is that all of these anti-development measures from the Liberals over the last 10 years have made Canada less competitive, and we need more than ever to compete with the United States, since we're bleeding manufacturing and auto sector jobs to them. Auto sector specific, we have called for the EV mandate to be completely banned, or to be completely done away with. So you may recall that the electric vehicle mandate from the Liberal government would penalize gas-powered auto producers to the tune of $20,000 per car if they go over the government-imposed quota. So imagine if you're an auto sector worker being hammered by the American tariffs. Would you be making investments in capital in Canada if there was an EV mandate hanging over your head? They've postponed it for 1 year, but it remains in place. So that would be certainly something we can do immediately to provide investment certainty to our auto sector today.
And quickly, what about worker support? What do you advocate to do there?
Again, the auto sector and the broader manufacturing sector are being hammered by high taxation from the Liberal government. They're being hammered by an anti-business environment after 10 years of Liberal government. Mr. Carney came to power 7 months ago promising that he was the one to get a deal with President Trump. He promised by July 21st. That was never delivered. He just went to Washington to negotiate a deal, came home empty-handed, and just days later, Stellantis announces that 3,000 jobs are at risk in Brampton, and they're moving their production to the United States. So we are seeing absolutely no deliverables, from this Liberal government or from Prime Minister Carney. We need to fight for our auto workers and get a job, get a jobs plan, and ensure that we have a deal with the United States. He promised that, Michael, and that's not being delivered. It's been 7 months. Canadians deserve results.
Raquel Dancho, thank you for this. Appreciate the time this evening.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Now, as we said, the jobs that Stellantis is moving to Illinois are jobs that were supposed to go to its assembly plant in Brampton, Ontario. And earlier in the day, I did speak with the Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown to get his reaction to the debate now happening in Ottawa. So, as you heard, a lot was said about Stellantis in the House of Commons today, about the people who live in your community. We also heard the industry minister talking about the fact that she's had a meeting today with Stellantis, with Unifor, and representatives of the Ontario government. I'm wondering if you've heard anything about those meetings and what's been shared so far.
So I had a meeting with Stellantis last week before they shared the bad news, and they said as long as there is tariffs on auto in Canada, there is no business case for auto production in our country. And so I'm not very optimistic unless we hear news from the Prime Minister that he has a deal with the U.S. I am very concerned about the prospect of auto jobs, not just in Brampton, but elsewhere in Canada. And for our community, this hurts. This stings. It's a big loss.
Hurts, as you say, but we did hear the Prime Minister reference again last week that he spoke with the Chief Executive Officer for Stellantis, the company reportedly looking for another vehicle that could be assembled at the Brampton plant. From what you just said, you're not holding out hope that that might actually happen?
Well, based on what I heard from Stellantis, they said as long as there's tariffs on auto, it would be a loss to build cars in Canada. And so unless something's changed, unless the Prime Minister believes he's close to a deal to remove tariffs on cars, I'm not very optimistic. And frankly, it's why I've said, we need to punch back legally against Stellantis for the taxpayer investments that have gone into that company. And we need to punch back against the U.S. The fact that we have dropped retaliatory tariffs, despite the fact our economy is being pummeled. Communities like Brampton are seeing job losses because of these tariffs. I know we were trying to be nice to get along and get a deal with the U.S., but here we are a year later and we don't have a deal. And so I want to see a response. I want to see a robust response from the Canadian government rather than assurances that something might be coming our way, down the road. It's so loose and without specifics. I don't think anyone in our community has confidence that there is something being returned to the plant anytime soon.
Okay, so you support the lawsuit if one comes from Ottawa against Stellantis. You support counter tariffs, any type of countermeasures against the United States. What do you then make of what we heard from the Conservative leader today, Pierre Poilievre, asking about the kind of obligations Ottawa has actually gotten from Stellantis to protect workers in this country, specifically the workers in your community? What do you make of that ask from Pierre Poilievre?
So I think it's a legitimate question. I think part of House of Commons, the theatrics of question period also comes with discussion of policy. And I think I would like to know what's inside that contract with Stellantis, not just the 2022 contract. In 2022, obviously there was investments based on retooling and production incentives. But don't forget the precursor to this company. The plant used to be Chrysler, and in 2009, the company received a bailout from the government of Canada under Stephen Harper. And so whether it was the 2009 bailout, whether it was the investment in 2022, what legal obligations does the company have to Canadian taxpayers and the Canadian government and the Ontario government? And so, yes, I want to know what legal obligations they have. I want those contracts analyzed. I hope that they're transparent and in the public. And I would like to see the government's response on that.
So we'll see what comes of that. As we heard from the Industry Minister, Melanie Joly, today, they have agreed to produce documents for the committee looking into this matter on the Hill. So we'll keep following that. I wonder, though, while I have you here, is it time to launch some type of retraining program for workers and accept the fact that auto production in this country, in your community, is essentially a declining industry with the stance that the big three are taking right now?
Well, I'm not ready to give up on the auto sector in Canada. I do think it's Donald Trump's wish to steal every plant from Canada and bring it to the U.S. But we've got a highly trained workforce that can build great product. And frankly, if American auto companies don't want to operate in Canada, maybe there are auto companies elsewhere in the world that will recognize this opportunity with a workforce that is already trained and with years of experience. Having said that, if deals like that aren't possible, they're not before the desk of Prime Minister Carney at this moment. There are auto producers elsewhere, in the world. But if a deal's not possible, if opportunities aren't before us, then yes, I would support retraining. It's very important we find work for these families. For a community to lose 3,000 good-paying jobs, it stings.
Now, the government at this point expects meaningful advancements, and that's their terminology, advancement in terms of steel, aluminum, and energy within weeks. But it looks like any agreement on autos may have to wait until a full renegotiation of CUSMA. And if that is the case, Mayor Brown, I'm wondering what should the government's midterm and long-term commitments be to your community and to auto workers across this country?
Well, I'd be worried if there's a potential deal on the table that doesn't include auto. It would be an abandonment that I think a lot of people would find egregious. Having said that, yeah, I would expect if the government, is abandoning auto, there would have to be some very visible and tangible supports. 3,000 jobs isn't limited to 3,000 jobs. It's the hospitality around the plant, the restaurants that support all those workers, the logistics sector that ships that product. It's the auto parts supply chain that is going to be impacted. This has ramifications well beyond the auto sector, and so it's why giving up on the auto sector, is the last resort. It's going to hurt well beyond the walls of that plant.
Mayor Patrick Brown, I appreciate the time this evening. Thanks for the insight.
Thank you.
Well, to the matter of the federal budget now. In just 2 weeks' time, the Carney government will table its first budget. And today, Conservatives called on the government to cap its deficit to $42 billion.
This will be the 10th Liberal budget. Already, they've doubled the debt, food bank lineups, and housing costs. Every dollar the government spends comes directly out of the pockets of Canadians who can no longer afford to eat, heat, and house themselves. Their fridges are empty, Mr. Speaker. Will they learn these costly lessons? Will they cap their inflationary deficits and get rid of their insane taxes on groceries?
Well, to talk about the upcoming budget is Kevin Page, Canada's first parliamentary budget officer. He served in that capacity from 2008 to 2015. He's gone on to found the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. He's also the CEO of that institute, which is at the University of Ottawa. Kevin Page, thank you for the time.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Listen, I'm going to begin here with that, I guess, the Conservative ask of today, that open letter, comments being made today, that they want the Carney government to limit the federal deficit to $42 billion. And, essentially, that would keep it in line with the deficit outlined in the Trudeau last budget tabled April of 2024. Is that a responsible deficit limit? Is that even possible to achieve?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to achieve at this point. I think like what we heard from the parliamentary budget officers, that the new baseline for this year is probably a deficit closer to $70 billion. So and we started with a deficit of $42 billion. The economy got weaker. There were a number of platform initiatives, actually in both the Conservative and Liberal platforms. So, we think we're probably looking at a deficit in the 70s, maybe $75 to $80 billion range. And again, in the context of an economy that is really not growing very fast, very sluggish, I think having a deficit, in this sort of 1.5 to 2.5 range is probably pretty healthy to stabilize the economy.
Healthy to stabilize the economy. But what about this $42 billion mark? Would that be a responsible target?
No. Yeah, I think effectively last year we ran a deficit of $50 billion. The economy was growing faster than it is now. Now the economy is obviously growing slower. We're actually talking about shrinking the deficit, and it would mean we'd have to put in some significant restraint measures. And I think, again, this is not a good time to do that.
Okay. Except that the current PBO, we heard him speak out a few weeks ago, essentially raising alarm at a deficit figure that he pegs at around $70 billion. Why don't you share the concerns that we heard from Monsieur Jacques?
Yeah, so I think it's, well, first of all, those concerns that we heard from the interim parliamentary budget officer, Mr. Jacques, were actually not in the report. So he released a fine report. This is the baseline deficit of about $70 billion, pretty much staying flat, maybe shrinking a little bit to $60 billion in the years ahead. And there was no sustainability analysis in it. There was no strong language in it. And I think, a $70 billion deficit for Canada, it's a little over 2 percentage points. Given the weakness of the economy, the unemployment rate has risen, to over 7%, probably going to grow around 1% this year. It's very weak output growth. I think that size of deficit relative to other countries, the United States in the 6 to 7% range, same for the United Kingdom, probably the average deficit in the G7, G20 is in that 5 to 7% range because of NATO commitments, because of weak economies, because of a slowing global economy. I think it's not a major problem. If you look at this size of this deficit relative to our history and relative to other countries, Canada's a AAA country. Like, no one's seeing any, that kind of alarm.
Okay, let me rewind a bit, because when you're talking about 2%, 5%, what you're talking about is deficit to GDP ratio.
Correct.
Okay, so that puts into context the numbers or the ratio that you have in mind. And it seems to me you're making the argument that now is actually a time to invest rather than to save. Why?
Yeah, I think it's. I think the Prime Minister uses this word, a hinge moment, and effectively a crisis that we find ourselves in, certainly with respect to the changing relationship with the United States. Canada's tight trading relationship with the Americans is, this is being fractured at this moment. There are a lot of others, we think fractures, like I think in the economy, socially, economically, even like with military spending, we've been underspending on the military for a number of years. We have to deal with some of these issues. I don't think we can delay, and I think that's the view of the government. And at this particular juncture, I support that view.
What's the opposite, though? If the government were not to invest and spend this much in this moment in time, what's the downside of that? Yeah,
I think it's becoming quite apparent that Canada and other countries as well, not the United States, though, we're suffering from this sort of longer-term growth problem, weak investment, and effectively real business capital formation for a number of years now has stayed completely flat. So we're not attracting private sector business investment, and the public sector investment has been it's been modest, but it hasn't been in the area of infrastructure, particularly, or innovation that's going to make a big difference. So, I think even some of my former bosses, like Mr. Dodge, who was the governor of the Bank of Canada, former deputy minister of finance I worked for him, said, the crisis that we find ourselves now, he was saying it was even bigger than the crisis we found ourselves in the 1990s after a Quebec referendum, dealing with a very high deficit. Our problem right now is not the deficit. It's about growth and dealing with some of these longer-term structural issues.
I think people would be surprised about the problem not being the deficit, because again, if you're pegging it at around $70 billion to $80, $85 billion, that is about double of what was projected by the last government in the last tabled budget in April of 2024. How is that not concerning?
I think, first of all, when I was at Department of Finance in the 80s, every year we ran deficits relative to the size of the economy, GDP, probably in the 5-6% range. So this, the kind of deficit that we're talking about now, in this context of this crisis, this hinge moment, this fracturing relationship with the United States, the need to kind of open up new trade corridors, east and west. It's to run a deficit at 2.5% when the economy is growing about half of its potential right now, not a huge problem. So, I think that there is issues. It's you shouldn't be, I shouldn't underplay with respect to debt interest costs. Because of COVID, the government ran up a significant amount of debt, so we're going to see interest costs rise significantly in nominal terms and as a percent of revenues, a percent of GDP. So that has to be monitored. But even when we look at those interest costs now and we compare them with the size of our economy or revenues, and we go back in time, they're still very modest. And so I think whether it's the director of the International Monetary Fund or it's I think the bond rating agencies, when they look at Canada, they see a AAA country. They see a country that has this history of correcting itself over time. I think even in the part of the Prime Minister's platform, it's we're going to run some higher deficits, but we're going to get to something called an operating balance in 2028-29, and that we'll have a declining debt to GDP ratio over the long run. And if we could hit those targets, I think we're in great shape.
Okay, when you say operating budget, that does point to something very interesting that we're going to see in this budget the first one tabled by the Carney government, because we know that already they're going to split essentially operating budget from capital budget. Conservatives have called that accounting trickery. Why should we have any faith in that?
Yeah, so I would disagree with the conservative interpretation of it. It's not even accounting. It's really just a reporting change that we're going to, and a reporting change that's going to lead to new fiscal targets, which I think is a good thing, which I think the conservatives should support. So I think, like, again, the idea that the government is putting out, which exists in other countries, which actually exists in some of our provinces, is we shouldn't be deficit financing current consumption. Transfers, to senior citizens, transfers to unemployed people, child care programs, even transfers to provinces, grants and contributions that are going to be consumed in that year. But it's a, so we finance that every single year. We pay for that as we go. But the idea of deficit financing, running a deficit of 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP that is focused just on capital formation, so investment in infrastructure, particularly investment in military equipment, investment in research and development, I think is seen widely as something that we desperately need, given what's happened to investment in this country for the past number of years. Okay,
if I'm hearing you correctly, then by what, showing responsibility on the operating side, it gives bond rating agencies, investors greater confidence on the capital side?
Well, I think bond rating agencies are going to look at a number of factors. They'll look at the overall deficit. They'll look at the financial requirements of the country. They'll look at the level of debt. They'll look at our financial assets. They'll look at the strength of our institutions. But they will look at those capital investments as well. So if we are going to be spending money on LNG, production, if we're going to be spending money on fixing ports, opening up new ports, on rare earth mines, that they're going to look at the quality of those investments. Is there going to be a return for that? And we need that in this country. We don't have that, and we're going to need those investments and a lot more. And so I think what the Prime Minister is saying, what the government is saying, is that we'll deficit finance just that capital investment, but as we'll pay as we go with respect to current consumption.
Okay. Well, of course, we're now about 2 weeks away from the budget itself. We'll speak again. Kevin Page, thank you for this.
Good to be with you.
Okay, a quick correction here. Mr. Page served as PBO from 2008 to 2013, not 2015. Sorry for that. And before we go this evening, you heard the Conservative leader calling for a cap in this year's budget. The government House leader did not actually respond to that call. Instead, Steve McKinnon used his response to criticize Pierre Poilievre for an interview he gave last week, in which Mr. Poilievre called the RCMP despicable and accused the force of covering up scandals for Justin Trudeau. Take a listen to what we heard from the government House leader on that.
But last week, the Leader of the Opposition put into question the independence of our judiciary, of the independence of our prosecutors, of the police, in fact, the very police that put their lives on the line to protect him, Mr. Speaker. The Leader has the next 30 seconds to make amends, to apologize, to tell the people of this chamber and this House that he is sorry for what he said. We don't do that in Canada, Mr. Speaker.
In turn, the Conservative leader did not respond to that comment. We do continue, though, to follow the story. Well, that is our program for this Monday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.